You've been lost. Maybe not seriously lost, maybe just the kind of lost where you're in an unfamiliar city and your phone dies. Or you take a wrong turn on a hike and spend 20 minutes figuring out which way is which. That mild disorientation, that brief moment of not knowing exactly where you are relative to where you need to be, it's uncomfortable. It produces a specific kind of anxiety that's hard to describe but instantly recognizable. Now scale that feeling up. Remove the phone. Remove the city. Remove the trail markers, the road signs, the distant hum of traffic that tells you civilization is nearby. Remove every landmark you recognize. Remove the knowledge that rescue services exist and that someone will come looking for you if you don't return. You're in a landscape you don't know, with no tools beyond what you're carrying, and the sun is moving across the sky, and you genuinely do not know which direction leads back to your group. That situation, being genuinely, seriously lost in an unfamiliar wilderness, was one of the most dangerous things that could happen to an early human. Not because of what it directly caused, but because of everything it prevented. You couldn't hunt effectively. You couldn't find the water sources you knew were safe. You couldn't return to the protection of your group before dark. And in a world full of predators, being alone and disoriented after nightfall was a potentially fatal situation. So how did early humans navigate? How did they find their way across landscapes that had no maps, no signs, no GPS? And what happened when the system failed and someone got genuinely lost? The answer involves some of the most sophisticated cognitive tools our species has ever developed, and some of the oldest. Let's get into it. Let's start with what early humans actually knew about their environment. Because the picture most people carry of prehistoric people stumbling through an unfamiliar world, hoping they'd recognize something, is almost entirely wrong. Early humans, especially those living as hunter-gatherers in stable territories, had extraordinarily detailed knowledge of their home landscapes. Researcher Louis Liebenberg, who has spent decades studying the tracking and navigation skills of sand people in the Kalahari Desert, has documented a level of environmental knowledge that researchers in cognitive science describe as equivalent to a detailed topographic map held entirely in memory. Sand trackers can navigate across hundreds of kilometers of desert landscape with no visible landmarks using a combination of memorized spatial relationships, subtle environmental cues, and what Liebenberg calls creative tracking, the ability to construct a mental model of where an animal has gone based on incomplete evidence. The same cognitive skills that make an excellent tracker make an excellent navigator. They are fundamentally the same skill. Building an accurate mental model of what is happening in a spatial environment based on available evidence. This kind of deep environmental knowledge doesn't come from formal education. It comes from spending your entire life in a landscape, paying close attention to it, and having it transmitted to you in story, in practice, and in the daily texture of moving through it with people who know it better than you do. The first and most fundamental navigation tool available to early humans was the sun. Specifically, the sun's arc across the sky, its position at sunrise, at midday, and at sunset, provides directional information that, once understood, is available to anyone with clear skies. In the northern hemisphere, the sun rises in the east, reaches its highest point in the south, and sets in the west. Shadows at solar noon point directly north. These relationships are consistent and reliable. Early humans would have learned them through observation and transmission, and they would have used them as a fundamental directional reference throughout their lives. Stars extend this capability into the night. In the northern hemisphere, Polaris, the North Star, sits almost directly above the celestial North Pole, making it a reliable directional anchor that doesn't move as the night sky rotates around it. Various star patterns served as navigational references for cultures around the world, and there is every reason to believe that early humans used them as well. Researcher Duane Hamacher at the University of Melbourne has documented the extraordinarily sophisticated astronomical knowledge embedded in Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, which include detailed understanding of star positions, movements, and their seasonal significance, knowledge that would have been essential for navigation across Australia's vast landscapes. Beyond celestial navigation, early humans had access to a remarkable range of environmental cues that function as directional indicators. The prevailing direction of wind in any given region tends to be consistent enough to serve as a rough directional reference. Mosses and lichens tend to grow on the shadier, moister sides of trees and rocks. In the northern hemisphere, this is typically the north-facing side. Snow melts faster on south-facing slopes. Rivers flow toward lower ground and eventually toward the sea or larger bodies of water. Animal trails tend to lead toward water sources. None of these cues is perfectly reliable. Wind direction varies. Moss grows where moisture is, not always on the north side. But the key insight, documented across traditional navigation cultures worldwide, is that expert navigators don't rely on any single cue. They triangulate between multiple cues, using each as a check on the others. When the sun's position, the wind direction, the slope of the land, the behavior of animals, and the memorized spatial relationships of landmarks all point the same direction, confidence is high. When they disagree, the skilled navigator pays closer attention and gathers more information. This multi-cue triangulation approach to navigation is not simple. It requires sustained attention, the ability to hold multiple pieces of spatial information in working memory simultaneously, and the capacity to update a mental model of position as new information arrives. It is, in cognitive terms, a sophisticated skill, one that takes years to develop, and that produces measurably better outcomes in experienced practitioners than in novices. Researcher David Uttal at Northwestern University has studied the development of spatial cognition across cultures and found that people who grow up in environments where active navigation is necessary, where they travel large distances on foot through varied terrain, without the assistance of maps or GPS, develop significantly more sophisticated spatial reasoning abilities than those who don't. This is not a genetic difference, it's an environmental one. The skills are cultivated by use and transmitted through practice. This means that early human groups living as mobile hunter-gatherers were, on average, navigating through space with cognitive tools that modern urban humans have largely allowed to atrophy. The average Paleolithic human probably had a richer and more accurate mental map of their home territory than most modern people have of the city they live in. But even excellent navigators got lost, and when they did, what happened? The first thing to understand is that getting lost for an early human was primarily a social crisis, not just an individual one. A person who was lost was separated from their group. And separation from the group, in a world of predators and limited individual capacity for survival, was genuinely dangerous in a way that most modern people never experience. This social dimension meant that the response to someone being lost was not an individual survival problem. It was a group response problem. The group had to find the lost person. And finding a lost person in a landscape without phones, without search and rescue services, without helicopters or dogs trained for the purpose, required a specific set of skills. Those skills centered on tracking. A person moving through a landscape leaves traces, footprints, broken vegetation, disturbed soil, displaced rocks. A skilled tracker reading these traces can reconstruct not just where someone went, but when they went there, how they were moving, and where they were likely heading based on their direction of travel and the terrain. Researcher David Lewis, who spent years documenting traditional navigation and tracking skills across multiple cultures, has argued that tracking is the original human information technology. It is the capacity to read the environment as a record of what has happened in it, to extract narrative information from physical traces, and it is almost certainly one of the oldest human cognitive skills, predating language in its fully modern form, because it was essential for both hunting and for finding lost or injured group members. The social response to a lost group member extended beyond tracking. It also involved sound. The use of calls, shouts, or signals to locate a lost person is documented across virtually every traditional culture where people live in dense terrain that limits sightlines. In forest environments especially, sound carries further than sight, and a coordinated system of calls, a signal that means "I am here" responded to by a signal that means "I hear you, come toward me." could allow a lost person to reorient and reconnect with their group, even without any visual contact. Fire and smoke served a similar function in open terrain. A signal fire, producing smoke visible from considerable distances during daylight and light visible at night, could guide a lost person back to camp or signal their location to searchers. The systematic use of fire as a communication technology, not just for warmth or cooking but for signaling across distance, is probably very ancient, though direct evidence is difficult to establish. This brings us to something important about what happened to the lost person themselves during the time before they were found or found their way back. Because survival while lost, in a Paleolithic context, required a specific set of responses that are not intuitive and that had to be learned. The most dangerous thing a lost person can do is panic and move randomly. Panic wastes energy, leads to injuries from moving fast through rough terrain without attention, and systematically destroys the spatial coherence that would allow reorientation. A lost person who runs in a random direction can quickly become catastrophically lost in a way that calm, attentive orientation behavior would have prevented. Traditional survival knowledge across cultures consistently emphasizes the same response to being lost. Stop. Assess. Use available cues to establish a sense of direction. Identify the most valuable information available in the environment: the position of the sun, the slope of the terrain, the sound of water, the direction of animal movement. Make a deliberate choice about direction rather than a panicked one. And if you hear anything that might be your group, a sound, a call, a distant voice, move toward it, making noise to indicate your presence. This response pattern is cognitively demanding. It requires overriding a panic response that is physiologically powerful and emotionally compelling. It requires maintaining the capacity for rational assessment under high-stress conditions. And it requires the accumulated environmental knowledge that tells you what the available cues mean. For early humans who had this knowledge, who had been trained in it from childhood, who had practiced it, who had been told stories about people who survived by using it and people who didn't, the response to being lost was a trained behavior, not an improvised one. The knowledge of what to do when lost was transmitted knowledge, not individual invention. There's also a dimension of this story that connects to something we haven't talked about yet: the emotional and social meaning of being lost for early humans. Being lost was not just physically dangerous. It was socially and emotionally terrifying in a way that modern urban humans have largely lost access to. The human need for group belonging, for the presence of familiar others, for the sense of being known and located in a social world as well as a physical one. These needs are profound and ancient. The psychological literature on solitary confinement, on shipwrecked castaways, on extreme isolation consistently shows that the loss of social connection is one of the most devastating experiences a human can undergo, even when physical needs are met. An early human who was lost was experiencing not just disorientation in space, but a profound disconnection from the social fabric that gave their life meaning and safety. The urgency of finding the group was not merely practical. It was existential. And the response of the group, the tracking, the calling, the fire signals, the organized search, was not just strategically rational. It was an expression of the bonds that held the group together. The effort invested in finding a lost person was a statement about their value to the group, about the non-contingent nature of belonging that is one of the things that distinguishes human social bonds from simpler forms of animal association. When a group member returned from being lost, when they walked back into camp, or were found and brought back, what happened in those moments told them something essential about their place in the world: that they were missed, that they were sought, that their absence had been noticed, and that their return mattered. That knowledge, that you would be looked for, may have been one of the most important things an early human could carry into a dangerous landscape. Not a skill, not a tool. The knowledge that the people around you would not let your absence go unmarked. If this one made you think about the people who would look for you, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one. There's one more dimension of this story that I want to explore before we close. The question of cognitive mapping, the internal representation of space that all humans carry, and that was the primary navigation technology of our species for most of our existence. Cognitive maps are not like paper maps. They are not accurate representations of geographic reality in the way that a satellite image is accurate. They are constructed from experience, weighted by importance, distorted by emotion and attention, and organized around landmarks, routes, and regions rather than coordinates. The place you walk through every day is represented richly and in detail. The place you pass through once is represented faintly and schematically. Neuroscientist John O'Keefe at University College London, who received the Nobel Prize in 2014 for his work on the brain's navigation system, discovered specialized neurons in the hippocampus that function as a spatial positioning system, what he called place cells. These neurons fire specifically when an individual is in a particular location in a familiar environment, creating a neural map of experienced space. Subsequent research by May-Britt Moser and Edvard Moser discovered grid cells, neurons that create a regular coordinate-like grid of space that allows the brain to track position and movement through an environment. This neural navigation system is ancient. It appears across mammals, including rodents, bats, and primates. It is not a recent human invention. It is a biological inheritance from hundreds of millions of years of animal evolution, and it was the foundation on which all human navigation skills were built. What early humans added to this biological foundation was cultural amplification. Stories that encoded spatial knowledge, names for landmarks that made them memorable and shareable, routes that were walked repeatedly until they became automatic, children taught to pay attention to specific cues in specific places. The biological navigation system is the hardware. The cultural transmission of spatial knowledge is the software. And together, they produced navigation capabilities that allowed human beings to colonize virtually every habitable environment on Earth. There is also something remarkable about the specific landscapes that early humans chose to inhabit, which connects directly to the question of navigation and getting lost. Researcher Gordon Oriens at the University of Washington has documented what he calls the savanna hypothesis, the observation that humans across cultures show a remarkably consistent aesthetic preference for certain types of landscape. Open terrain with scattered trees, water visible or implied nearby, gentle slopes that allow sightlines in multiple directions, and the presence of refuges, dense vegetation, or elevated ground within easy reach. This preference, Oriens argues, reflects evolved preferences for landscapes that maximize navigability and minimize the danger of getting lost. Open terrain allows you to see where you are. Scattered trees provide landmark variety without obscuring sightlines. Water features provide both sustenance and navigational anchors. Elevated ground provides the visual overview that allows spatial orientation. In other words, early humans may have preferentially inhabited and traveled through landscapes that were easy to navigate, that minimized the risk of getting lost in the first place. The choice of where to move through was itself a navigation strategy. This insight has a surprising implication for why humans consistently find certain landscapes beautiful. The landscapes that feel most appealing to most people, across cultures and throughout history, rolling hills, scattered trees, visible water, open views, may feel that way partly because they are the landscapes in which our ancestors were least likely to get lost. Beauty and safety in this view are not separate things. The landscape that looks inviting looks that way partly because it was navigable. And navigability, for most of human history, was survival. And there is one final thread I want to pull on: the relationship between navigation, storytelling, and memory in early human cultures. Across virtually every traditional culture where people navigate large territories on foot, navigation knowledge is encoded in stories. Not as a secondary artifact, but as the primary transmission medium. The story is how the knowledge travels from one generation to the next. In Aboriginal Australian culture, songlines, narratives that describe routes across the landscape, served as mnemonic devices that encoded detailed navigational information in a memorable and transmissible form. Specific songs described specific landscapes in sequences that corresponded to actual geographic routes. Singing the song in the right sequence was equivalent to consulting a map. The knowledge was in the narrative. Similar patterns appear across indigenous cultures of the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific. Stories that describe journeys encode the spatial knowledge of those journeys. The characters in the story encounter the same landmarks in the same order that a real traveler would encounter following the same route. The narrative structure provides the organization that makes the spatial information memorable and retrievable. This connection between storytelling and navigation has a profound implication. It suggests that some of the oldest human stories, stories that predate writing by tens of thousands of years, were not just entertainment or spiritual expression. They were navigation databases. They were the means by which early humans encoded and transmitted the spatial knowledge that allowed them to move safely through their world. The campfire story, the ancient myth, the heroic journey that takes a character from one place to another and back again. These may be, among other things, very old navigation lessons. The story of the hero who crosses the desert, finds water at the base of the Red Rocks, follows the river north, and returns home is not just a metaphor for something else. It may literally have been a description of a real route, encoded in narrative because narrative is what the human brain finds most memorable. If that's true, then the stories our ancestors told, the ones that have survived in fragments in myth and legend and religious narrative, carry within them the ghost of landscapes that early humans navigated. The spatial knowledge of people who are long gone, preserved in the only form that survived the passage of time. That's not a small thing to contemplate. And if this one made you think about the landscape around you a little differently, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.